At the far edge of the continent where red soil kissed the sky and whispers floated on the wind, there lay the ancient village of Ukanga. Isolated and suspended between time and tradition, Ukanga was a land of secrets hidden beneath silence and rituals guarded by trembling hands. Dense thickets surrounded it like sentinels, but it was the forbidden forest of Ibomboko that cast the longest shadow. No villager dared venture into it unless desperate, or mad, for within that gnarled labyrinth of vines and mist was a spirit no prayer could soothe and no offering could calm. The village sat just a stone's throw from that forest's edge, and near its borders stood the infamous Tree of Lament, a gnarled, sprawling thing whose roots ran so deep that people said it fed on the bones of the forgotten. The bark was dark and slick with sap that wept like tears. Birds avoided its branches. Children were warned to never speak beneath it. It wasn't just the ominous shape or the way its branches creaked even on windless days that terrified the villagers, it was what had happened there 20 years ago. It was the story no one told in full but every child knew by heart. The tree was where Ayanda had been buried. Ayanda, beautiful, sharp-tongued, unyielding. A midwife and herbalist, known for her knowledge of roots, seasons, and strange songs passed down by the women of her line. They said she walked barefoot even through thorn paths, that snakes bowed before her. And they said she whispered to the trees. One night, during a time of stillborn births and vanishing livestock, a cry went up that a child had died in Ayanda's care. No proof followed, only fear. The elders summoned her. She stood tall before them, refusing to bow, refusing to confess. The people needed someone to blame. The wind stirred. A vote was cast. And with fire in their hands and judgment in their eyes, they buried her beneath the ancient tree near Ibomboko, still alive, some whispered. Her screams had stopped suddenly, they remembered, too suddenly. Zenzal was 5 then. Small, curious, soft-eyed. She had clung to her mother's waist during the trial. After Ayanda was gone, no family claimed the girl. That is, until the elder Malangui and his wife Letha took her in with uneasy smiles and promises of charity. Some called it an act of kindness. Others, a way to keep the girl close, watch her, tame her, ensure nothing unnatural stirred in her veins. Zenzal barely spoke in those early years. She would sit for hours near the river, fingers dipped in the water, eyes watching nothing. She slept curled like a frightened cat and never laughed like other children. But her silence wasn't empty. It was listening. Time crept through Ukanga like mist. But peace did not return. Drought settled into the bones of the land like disease. Rain would form in the skies only to vanish like a lie. Cows gave milk that turned sour before it cooled. Children were born only to die in days, their bodies light as feathers, their mothers weeping into silent nights. One summer, 3 huts burned down without cause. The flames danced like angry spirits, refusing water. Each time something terrible happened, villagers turned uneasy glances toward the forest. Toward the Tree of Lament. Toward the girl who had now grown into a woman. Zenzal had blossomed like the moon, slowly, quietly, luminously. She was no longer the shadow child people had whispered about. She grew into beauty without effort, her skin smooth like oil and her eyes dark like river stones. Her voice was soft, but when she sang, even the trees seemed to listen. She never married. Some men tried, but one fell sick days after courting her and another lost his hearing. They called it coincidence. But they stopped trying. She wandered often, at dawn, before others stirred, and late at dusk when the village grew quiet. And strange things followed her. She would speak of a coming storm days before it formed. Once, she told a fisherman not to go to the lake. He laughed. He drowned. She touched a sick child on the forehead, and by nightfall, the fever was gone. Her gifts, they called them at first. Blessings. Until the blessings became unsettling. One day, she stood still in the middle of the market, eyes closed, whispering words no one understood. When asked, she simply said, "The ancestors are warning." Days later, a snake slid into the chief's compound, biting his prized goat and vanishing without a trace. The chief never looked at Zenzal the same way again. the whispers returned. She has her mother's eyes. She walks barefoot through thorny paths, like Ayanda did. She talks to the air. The elders, old now, slower, grayer, but not softer, began to fear again. It was not just the girl, but what she represented. A mistake they had buried under a cursed tree. A truth they had hoped would rot into silence. Zenzile seemed to feel it too. She would stand under the tree of lament, not in fear but in conversation. Sometimes she cried there, sometimes she sang. Sometimes she simply listened. The air would grow heavy around her, like something was pressing against the veil between the living and the dead. She said nothing of what she heard. Ukanga, a village that had not known true peace since Ayanda's death, held its breath. The forest grew thicker. The winds began to speak again. And the elders, who once held the world in their fists, began to dream of Ayanda's face. They woke with sweat and terror, feeling the weight of the past like a stone on their chests. They had buried a woman beneath a tree and planted a curse. But what they hadn't realized was that the seed they feared had not died. It had grown. It had taken root in Zenzile. And something they couldn't name, was beginning to stir. The sun rose with a strange chill on the morning that marked the beginning of preparations for Ukanga's festival of cleansing. It was a festival held only once every 15 years, when the moon would bleed a reddish hue and the wind stood still for a night. The villagers believed it to be a sacred time, one where curses could be broken, bad spirits sent away, and harmony restored to the land. For years, they had awaited its return, praying for release from the string of tragedies that had become their daily life. Crops failed. Wombs failed. Fire came without warning. Hope had grown brittle. Drums began to echo across the village square as women scrubbed the thresholds of their huts with ash and salt, and men arranged sacred stones in a spiral around the banyan altar. Children were dressed in white linen, and old chants were pulled from the mouths of aging griots who could barely remember the original words. The rhythm of ritual had begun. But under the surface of this spiritual pageantry, another rhythm pulsed, secret, sharp, and bitter. In a darkened hut away from the dancing fires, the elders of Ukanga gathered not to pray, but to plot. Chief Malengwi sat with a rigid back and hollowed eyes. Age had not softened him, only hardened his resolve. He slammed his carved staff against the earth. "We must do it now, or we risk everything. She walks too close to her mother's path." And we all know how that ended. The room murmured in grim agreement. Old Letha, whose hands once stroked Zenzile's hair when she was a girl, now looked away in shame. Elder Jaji leaned forward. "We must make the people see the truth, that Zenzile is the root of our afflictions. They are already whispering. We will give those whispers a voice." And so they did. The next morning, while smoke from incense still curled over the village, rumors slithered like snakes through the narrow alleys. A child screamed that she had seen Zenzile shift into a crow at dusk. A fisherman swore on his dead brother's bones that he'd seen her walk through a pit of fire barefoot, her skin untouched. An old widow claimed Zenzile had stared into her eyes and made her forget her own name. Fear, once held at bay by ritual and prayer, now erupted like a sickness. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men spit after speaking her name. Eyes followed her like arrows. And Zenzile, who had grown used to being watched, now felt the gaze change, turning from curiosity to accusation, from awe to terror. She kept to herself more in those days. She still helped the sick, still fetched water, but she no longer sang by the river. At night, she sat alone, her hands trembling as she stared into flames that seemed to whisper things only she could hear. Then the dreams began. They came in fragments at first. A tree with weeping branches. A woman's voice, broken, urgent. Then faces blurred by soil. Then screams muffled by roots. Each time, Zenzile awoke with her breath caught in her throat and her sheets damp with sweat. But one night, the dream grew sharp and unbearable. She stood beneath the tree of lament, but it was not still. The roots were writhing like snakes. And her mother, Ayanda, stood half buried in the ground, her face pale with death but her eyes burning with life. She spoke without moving her lips. They will betray you, just as they did me. Zenzile reached forward, but her hands passed through Ayanda's face like smoke. The tree groaned. Thunder cracked. And Ayanda whispered, when the sky hums but does not rain, do not sleep. The time will come to choose. Zenzile woke with a scream lodged in her throat. The night was heavy, too heavy. No breeze. No insect song. The air vibrated, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She ran outside and looked to the sky. A storm. But not a normal one. Clouds rolled like dark wool above the village, thick and low, but no rain fell. Lightning flashed silently in the distance, illuminating the shape of the forest, the river, and finally, the tree. It stood still, but the air around it shimmered. Energy pulsed like a drumbeat. Zenzile wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked barefoot through the silent village. Her feet knew the way. Past the market, past the shrine, past the edge where most turned back. The trees seemed to lean away from her. The air thickened. And when she arrived, the tree of lament stood taller than she remembered. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped forward, until her toes touched the base of the tree. "Mother," she whispered. "Are you there?" There was no voice. No flash of ghostly light. But she felt it, a pull in her chest, like a thread tugged from beneath the earth. Her heartbeat slowed. Then quickened. Then slowed again, until it no longer felt like her own rhythm, but that of something older, deeper. She knelt, placing her palm flat against the roots. They were warm. Beneath them, the ground pulsed. And in that moment, Zenzile felt something awaken. Not in the tree. Not in the wind. In her. A memory she had never lived flickered through her, being buried alive, the press of soil against lungs, the sound of villagers chanting above, the agony of being silenced. It wasn't her memory. It was Ayanda's. Zenzile recoiled, gasping. But her hand stayed pressed to the root. The heartbeat beneath it did not fade. She rose slowly, dazed, and looked into the darkness beyond the tree. She felt something watching her. Not with hatred. Not with pity. With anticipation. The storm rumbled overhead, but not a single drop of rain fell. The next day, the festival would begin. Drums would beat, fires would be lit, and chants would rise. But Zenzile knew, now more than ever, that it wasn't a celebration. It was a trap. And the ground beneath Ukanga was no longer sleeping. The morning of the festival of cleansing arrived clothed in brilliance. Ukanga shimmered beneath the golden dawn. Drums pounded with feverish joy, and villagers painted each other's faces in ash and crimson clay. Children sang songs of renewal and healing as the elders led processions around the central altar. Even the river, which had run low and muddy for months, seemed to glisten with false promise. Zenzile stood near the back of the crowd, silent. Her eyes traced the sky, noting how the strange storm from the night before had vanished without a trace. Not even dew clung to the leaves. Yet the air still crackled, like something unfinished hung above them all, waiting. She had considered fleeing in the night. But something buried beneath the tree, had whispered to her heart that escape was not the answer. That it was time to face what had slept for too long. That it would end where it had begun. A horn sounded. Chief Malangui, draped in red and gold robes, raised his staff, calling for silence. He was flanked by the elders, all dressed in ceremonial garb. Their faces were unreadable. "People of Ukanga," the chief boomed, "today, the earth will be made whole again. Today, the sky shall see our devotion. Today, we offer our prayers, and our courage." The crowd cheered. "We have among us," Malangui continued, "a child born of pain. A child who has walked through fire and shadow. A child touched by the spirit world. And yet she has chosen to heal. To help. To love." The villagers turned, surprised, as he extended a hand. "Zenzile, daughter of Ayanda, come forward." She stepped forward slowly. Her heart pounded, but her face was calm. People parted for her like water. Children stared wide-eyed, unsure whether to smile or recoil. When she reached the circle of elders, the chief took her hand and raised it. "We honor this woman," he said, "for her service. For her strength. For her grace." The crowd clapped. A few people shouted her name. Then Malangui's voice shifted, lowering into something colder. "But we must also ask, at what cost has this strength come? What burns behind her kindness? What spirit stirs in her soul?" The crowd quieted. "She is not just Ayanda's child," said Elder Jaji, stepping forward. "She is Ayanda reborn. The curse never left. It merely changed its face." Gasps rippled through the gathering. "She walks with the wind," said another. "She speaks with unseen tongues. She visited the cursed tree on the eve of the cleansing. She is the reason our crops die. She walks like a witch in the moonlight. She is the storm." The accusations came fast, faster than she could process. Faces blurred into one mass of rage and fear. Some cried. Some shook their heads. A few, especially the younger ones who had been helped by her herbs or healed by her touch, shouted in protest. "No! This is madness. She saved my son. She's no witch." But it was too late. The elders had planted the seeds, and the soil of fear was fertile. Zenzile did not run. She did not cry. She simply looked at the chief and asked, "So this is the truth you promised to restore?" Malangui's lips tightened. Two guards stepped forward. Strong men. Hard eyes. They hesitated only for a moment before grabbing her arms. She did not resist. "Zenzile, daughter of Ayanda," the chief intoned, "you are accused of harboring evil, of carrying the cursed spirit of your mother, and of bringing ruin upon our land. The tree of lament cries for justice." The crowd murmured. Some chanted. Others turned their faces away in shame. The guards shackled her wrists and ankles in chains once used for slaves, chains the village had not seen in years. As the sun lowered and the flames of the cleansing fires rose, the procession began. The drums no longer beat with joy. They pounded with doom. Chants filled the air, not prayers, but condemnations. Zenzile was marched through the village square, past those she had helped, past those who now wept into their hands, too afraid to speak. She met every gaze. She kept walking. The path turned toward the forbidden forest, toward the clearing where the tree of lament stood tall and unmoving. And there, silhouetted by torchlight, she saw it. A rope. A noose. Hanging from a branch that had grown longer than the rest, stretched directly over the spot where her mother had been buried 2 decades ago. Zenzile stopped walking. The guards tugged, but she resisted just enough to speak. "I see it now," she said, her voice echoing louder than expected. "You feared her because she saw what you were. And now you fear me for the same reason." Malangui stepped forward. "You will not curse this land anymore. With your death, the soil will breathe again." Zenzile's eyes blazed. "You bury nothing with truth," she said. "You only feed the roots of lies." She looked up at the tree. The branches did not sway. The air had gone utterly still. "Hang me then. Let the soil drink the last blood of your false peace. But know this." She raised her head higher. "Now it will rise." The crowd held its breath. The guards dragged her to the base of the tree. The noose was lowered. The drums beat slower. The chanting softened. She climbed the small mound without help. Above her, the stars began to vanish behind thick, swirling clouds. She did not tremble. The rope was placed around her neck. She closed her eyes. And the earth shivered. The rope creaked as Zenzile's body lifted from the ground, her toes curling in air, her white dress billowing like a shroud. A hush fell over the clearing, unnatural and heavy, as if even the crickets had forgotten how to sing. The villagers stared, some with mouths open, others in tears, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight. Then it began. A single gust of wind howled from the depths of the Ibomboko forest, so sudden and forceful that it bent the towering trees in all directions. The flames in the torches flared violently, some going out with a hiss. Mothers clutched their children. The drum stopped. The guards stepped back, shielding their eyes from the dust and leaves that swirled into the air like spirits untethered. From above, lightning cracked across the sky. It did not bring rain, only light so bright it blinded. A jagged bolt split the heavens and slammed into the tree of lament. The tree screamed. The sound wasn't wood cracking, it was something deeper, something buried. The ground beneath it quaked, and from the roots, two glowing forms burst free. Light and smoke spiraled outward, knocking villagers off their feet. The noose holding Zenzile snapped midair. Her body fell, but did not hit the earth. She floated. Her head hung low, hair cascading over her face. But then her eyelids opened. They glowed an unnatural gold, burning and hollow all at once. The spirits pulsed in the clearing. One was unmistakable, Ayanda, glowing in shades of emerald and fire, her long braids flowing behind her, her eyes wet with sorrow and rage. The other was older, darker, faceless yet ancient, a presence more felt than seen. This second spirit emanated with the scent of moss, old soil, and rainstorms that had never arrived. The villagers would later say it was the guardian of Ibomboko, the spirit protector that the ancestors betrayed when they first chopped sacred trees to build the village. Zenzile's limp body lowered gently to the roots, cradled by unseen arms. The air thickened. The sky, once of faded dusk, deepened to a crimson hue, as though the heavens themselves had been wounded. A great voice echoed through the land. Not heard through ears, but felt in the bones. You silenced justice. Now justice speaks. The village erupted into chaos. Children screamed. Dogs howled and fled. Birds took to the sky in flocks, flapping in frantic spirals. Fires erupted in places untouched by torch or lightning, curling around the elders in a ring of judgment. The spirits did not touch with hands, they reached with memory. Chief Malengwi fell to his knees, clutching his chest, gasping as though something heavy had landed on him. His eyes rolled back, and suddenly, he was not in the clearing. He was 20 years younger, standing before Ayanda as she begged for her life. He saw himself again, twisting the truth of a failed harvest into a story of dark magic. He watched his own mouth move, accusing, condemning, sentencing a young mother whose only crime was knowledge too deep for his comfort. His screams echoed through the clearing. Elder Jaji tried to flee, but the earth beneath him cracked, and roots sprang up, tangling around his legs. He was thrown backward into the memory of the night he ordered Ayanda's child to be taken, to be raised not with love but with surveillance. He relived each moment of watching Zenzile grow, always looking for signs of her mother, always twisting her acts of compassion into suspicion. He cried out, sobbing, as Ayanda's voice whispered in his ears, "You feared my love more than my wrath." One by one, the elders were brought to their knees. Forced to relive the night Ayanda died, how they mocked her as she wept, how they planted the lie of witchcraft into the hearts of the villagers to keep power. Each memory came with the voices of their victims. Women who had miscarried under their false rituals. Families starved when accused of harboring spirits. Blood spilled for control. Even the villagers who had remained silent felt it, visions in their minds of how they turned their backs, how they whispered but never stood up, how fear had become their gospel. Zenzile's body still lay cradled in roots, her eyes closed, lips parted. Ayanda knelt beside her daughter's body, her translucent hands stroking her cheek. The ancient guardian loomed behind them both, spreading its light into the forest, pulling life from dead soil, reviving fallen trees, making animals crawl from burrows and stare in silent reverence. From the forest, owls emerged. Monkeys sat in solemn rows. The wind carried distant howls from places untouched by man. Justice had awakened, not to destroy, but to correct. The tree of lament shed its bark like old skin. Its trunk pulsed with light, and from its branches grew blossoms, blood-red and glowing. Ayanda rose, floating above the villagers. Her voice rang out, not as a curse, but a prophecy. When truth is buried, it grows into thorns. And when lies bloom, they cut the hands that planted them. The ancient guardian raised its arms. A pulse of energy swept through the land. Fire turned to mist. The crimson sky began to clear. The wind settled. Zenzil's chest moved. A slow breath. Her eyes opened. Not glowing now, human. Alive. Ayanda turned to her, smiling. You were always meant to be the root and the flower. And with that, Ayanda's spirit dissolved into light, absorbed by the tree, by the land, by the wind. The ancient guardian followed, its towering form collapsing into a swirl of leaves that scattered across the clearing and vanished into the air. Zenzil sat up, blinking. Alive. Changed. The villagers watched her in stunned silence, those who had condemned her now wordless, hollow, cracked wide open by the truth they could never forget. Justice had not come to kill them. It had come to make them remember. That night, Ukanga did not sleep. The air carried a sickly sweetness, like rotting fruit laced with blood. The wind wailed through the thatched huts, and shadows stretched too far under the dim moonlight. The screams began just after midnight, rising in waves, moving from hut to hut like a tide of madness. Inside one home, the walls began to bleed. Thick, red trails oozed from the cracks between the mud bricks, dripping onto the mat where a child had just been sleeping. The mother screamed, clutching her son, but the blood only poured faster, spelling something on the floor in a language no one had spoken for 1,000 years. In another house, a man woke to find his wife's face missing, not gone, but replaced with a mirror reflecting not his wife, but his own younger self holding a burning torch, watching a woman scream as she was dragged through the village. The man howled, his sanity unraveling with every breath. The river that curled around Ukanga, once the lifeblood of their crops, turned black as pitch. Frogs floated belly up. Fish surfaced with their eyes melted away. The villagers who went to draw water found their reflections staring back with accusing eyes, whispering their secrets in their own voices. Children cried without knowing why. Babies screamed in perfect silence, mouths wide open, soundless. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Mothers wept and rocked them, whispering prayers the spirits no longer answered. The elders, now pale with fear, tried to flee. They packed satchels and took secret paths out of the village, but each time they walked, the forest rearranged itself. Paths split in spirals, the trees whispering secrets with every crunch of footstep. Some elders walked for hours only to return, dazed, to the tree of lament. It stood taller now. Stronger. Its bark was black and smooth like obsidian, its blossoms still red and glowing like hearts torn from living chests. On the second night, the spirits became personal. One by one, a different household received a visitor, not in flesh, but in shadow, wind, and memory. Doors creaked open without touch. Fire pits flared on their own. Mirrors cracked. And from the corners of homes, Ayanda's spirit stepped forth, her eyes heavy, her mouth soft with sorrow. She spoke no curses. She did not scream. She showed. In the home of Elder Beso, she showed a vision of a crying girl, his own niece, who disappeared years ago. The villagers thought it was spirits, but the vision revealed him pushing her into the forest after she discovered his hidden stash of stolen offerings. The girl's final cries echoed through the hut. Beso fell to his knees, sobbing, reaching for forgiveness. Ayanda's spirit reached toward him, but instead of mercy, she placed a mark on his forehead. A red handprint. It burned into his flesh and glowed in the night. Truth does not erase blood, her voice echoed, before vanishing. Other elders faced their own unraveling. Elder Noma saw herself as a young woman, whispering lies about Ayanda to win favor from the chief. Elder Kegul saw the moment he replaced sacred herbs in the fertility shrine with ash to fake Ayanda's curse. Each of them screamed. Each was marked. The spirits demanded more than apologies. They wanted truth lived, not just confessed. By the third night, even the youth, those too young to remember Ayanda's death, began seeing things. Zenzil, now living in a trance between spirit and skin, wandered silently through the village. She did not eat. She did not sleep. Her presence stilled the air around her. Where she stepped, flowers bloomed. Where she gazed, lies dissolved like mist. People began whispering that she had become something else, neither ghost nor woman, but something in between. The villagers dared not speak her name aloud. A group of young men and women gathered in secret. Among them were Nathi, who had once loved Zenzile from afar, Sabu, whose mother died giving birth during a cleansing ritual, and Amelie, whose older brother vanished the night after Ayanda's hanging. They met in the dark near the old drums, where the spirits seemed not to listen. There, they made a pact, not of revenge, but of truth. "We were children," Nathi said, "but the stories we were told, none of them make sense. If we let the elders bury the past again," Amelie added, "the spirits will never leave." They decided to find the truth. Not the stories handed down from cowards and liars, but the real truth, hidden in memories, buried scrolls, and voices that had been silenced. They would speak to the few villagers who remembered Ayanda not as a witch, but as a woman, brilliant, healing, feared because she dared to speak. They would search the sacred grove the elders had forbidden them from entering. They would find what Ayanda was protecting, what her daughter had inherited, and why the forest had kept silent for so long. Because now it whispered again. And in the whisper was a name none of them recognized, a name older than Yukanga, older than the elders, older than the curse. The youth swore that they would not be like the generations before them. They would not let fear write history in blood. And as they made their vow under the bruised sky, the tree of lament rustled. Not in anger, but in approval. The sky was quiet when they began to dig. No wind moved the trees, no bird dared to sing. The forest, which had shrieked and whispered in torment the nights before, now waited in stillness. It wasn't the stillness of peace, it was reverence, like the hush before a prayer. The 5 youths stood before the tree of lament, holding crude digging tools carved from old farming blades and bones. Zenzile stood barefoot between them, her eyes dull with otherworldly calm, her hair shifting slightly even in the still air, as if responding to unseen rhythms. "We dig here," she said softly, touching the earth between 2 great roots that coiled like sleeping serpents. The moment the first strike hit the soil, a low hum rippled through the ground, and the tree shuddered, not in protest, but as if sighing in relief. It was not easy work. The soil clung like glue, damp and sticky despite weeks without rain. Nathi and Sabu worked in turns, their hands blistered and fingers bleeding. Amelie and the others cleared roots with careful hands, making sure not to sever what might be sacred. As they dug deeper, the smell of old smoke and wet moss grew stronger. Zenzile knelt nearby, eyes closed, whispering words in a language she did not know she knew. Then they found her. It was Amelie who uncovered the first bone, a thin, delicate hand curled inward, still clutching something wrapped in faded blue cloth. The bones were laid neatly, undisturbed by time, sheltered by the tree's very roots as though the forest itself had preserved her. Her skull faced upward, hollow sockets fixed toward the heavens. Around her neck was a twisted vine, still slightly green, the noose that had ended her life. Zenzile stepped forward and reached down with reverent hands. The cloth bundle was warm to her touch. As she unwrapped it, the others leaned in and gasped, not from fear, but awe. Inside was a scroll. Sealed with red wax, marked by a symbol none of them had ever seen but all somehow recognized. It resembled the tree itself, roots spiraling down, branches reaching upward, a circle between them. The seal cracked open at Zenzile's touch, and the scroll unfurled like it had been waiting. There was no ink, only glowing marks, lines of fire written across the page in a language of symbols that twisted and shimmered. Zenzile read aloud, and her voice became 2, hers and another, older, deeper. The spirits joined her, their energy wrapping around the youths like a cloak. The scroll told Ayanda's truth. She had been no witch. She had been a forest priestess, appointed by the guardians of Ibumboko to maintain the balance between the spirit world and the human. Her knowledge of herbs, her ability to speak to the wind and read the rain, had once made her beloved. But fear grew when the old chief's son fell ill, sickened not by disease, but by the horrors he had committed against villagers and sacred land. He had defiled a shrine, slain spirit-marked animals, and taken women under threat of death. Still, the chief demanded Ayanda use the sacred healing herb, known only to priestesses, to save him. She refused. That refusal was her undoing. The chief labeled her a witch. The elders, fearing the chief more than the truth, turned on her. The villagers, stirred by fear and lies, demanded her death. She was hanged beneath the tree, her body buried at its roots to trap her spirit. Zenzile had been 5. But even then, she had been different. Born during a rare eclipse when the shadow of the moon passed twice over Ukanga in one night, Zenzile had cried not at birth but at dawn, when Ayanda whispered a prayer into her ear. She was a child of both realms, blood of a human, soul touched by spirit. Her life had been meant to restore what had been broken. The scroll revealed that Ayanda's death was not the end of the story. It was a trigger. Her unjust execution opened a wound in the veil between the worlds, a wound that festered for years. The droughts, the fires, the stillborn children, these were not Ayanda's curses, but the consequences of spiritual imbalance. Zenzile's own death, so like her mother's, had been the final key. A sacrifice born of injustice that forced the spirits to awaken, to act, to confront the village with what it had hidden for 2 decades. Zenzile's eyes shimmered as she finished reading. This was never vengeance, she whispered. It was justice sleeping. And now it remembers. The spirits around them shifted. The once ghastly forms of Ayanda and the ancient guardian emerged fully, their presence no longer terrifying but radiant. Ayanda's eyes met her daughter's, not as a ghost seeking peace, but as a mother seeing her legacy fulfilled. The guardian spirit, older than the village, older than language, bowed to the youths. You have uncovered truth, it said in a voice like rustling leaves and distant thunder. Now comes the reckoning. The tree pulsed once, as if in agreement, and the scroll turned to ash in Zenzile's hands, its knowledge absorbed. The youths stood in silence, knowing the village would never be the same. But something else stirred below. A deeper root. A deeper truth. For this was not just about Ukanga's sins. It was about what happens when fear buries the truth, when justice is silenced by power, when the sacred is condemned because it refuses to serve corruption. And now the dead would no longer be silent. The drums began to beat just before the first light of dawn. Not the festival drums of celebration, but deep, thunderous strikes that vibrated through bone and earth. Every man, woman, and child in Ukanga awoke to the sound, their hearts seized with fear, not the shallow fear of rumor, but the kind that sinks into marrow, ancient and ancestral. The sky was not dark, nor was it bright. It hung in a strange twilight, the horizon bleeding amber where the sun should rise but not daring to pierce through the thick mist creeping in from Ibomboko. The villagers emerged from their homes in silence, drawn as if by unseen strings. No one spoke. Even the most stubborn elders who still whispered against Zenzile's name found themselves barefoot in the morning dew, walking toward the tree of lament. But the tree was no longer the same. It glowed faintly, its bark streaked with gold like veins of fire trapped in wood. The leaves shimmered silver, whispering in a wind that did not touch anything else. And beneath it stood 2 figures, Zenzile and Ayanda, mother and daughter, spirit and blood. Zenzile hovered slightly above the ground, her feet not touching the earth, her eyes glowing like twin moons. A crown of flickering flame circled her head, yet she did not burn. Beside her, Ayanda stood clothed in robes of wind and shadow, her presence no longer vengeful but regal, priestess once more. The villagers fell to their knees, not by command but by understanding. This was no longer their village. This was a courtroom of the spirit realm. They had become the judged. Without warning, the ground before the tree cracked open, not in destruction, but as a mirror. Each villager looked into it and saw themselves reflected not as they were, but as they had been when choices mattered most. One by one, visions began to play out in the air above the tree, as if pulled from memory. The first showed Elder Kwame, years younger, accepting cattle from the old chief in exchange for testifying against Ayanda. His voice, loud and righteous in the vision, condemned her with lies. In the present, he trembled, tears streaming down his cheeks. The next vision displayed Nkulu standing at the edge of Ayanda's hut as it burned, refusing to help though her child cried inside. His face, frozen in fear then, now twisted in shame. Another showed Nathi's own father stealing sacred herbs from Ayanda's grove and trading them to foreigners. When Ayanda found out and confronted him, he spread the first rumor that she flew with crows. Dozens of such memories filled the air, each unveiling truths that had been buried beneath decades of silence, fear, and cowardice. And then came the worst, visions of the villagers watching. Watching Ayanda be dragged. Watching Zenzile grow up alone, whispered about, avoided, pitted but never embraced. The silence that followed was unbearable. Children clung to their mothers, unsure if they were afraid of the spirits or of their own parents' sins. Some of the young men and women wept openly. Elders lowered their heads, stripped of their pride. Zenzile's voice broke the silence, not in screams, but in a language none had ever heard, yet all could understand. It was the voice of earth and air, water and flame. It spoke with echoes of the old gods and whispered with the leaves of Ibomboko. "You are seen," she said. "You are remembered." She turned, and Ayanda placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Together, they stepped forward, their figures brightening. "There are those among you who have repented in truth," Zenzile continued. "Your regret is not enough to undo pain, but it is the beginning of new roots. You are forgiven, not by us, but by the earth that knows you still have work to do." A golden flame marked the foreheads of a few villagers, the youths who had dug, the mothers who had once shared food with Ayanda in secret, the young lovers who had defended Zenzile before her death. They glowed gently, like sunrise in the fog. But others, those who still clutched pride, who whispered curses in their hearts even now, who felt not sorrow but resentment, were marked differently. Shadows slithered over their eyes. They were not cursed, but they had been seen. And spirits never forgot. Ayanda raised her hand, and the wind grew sharp. "We do not destroy what can still grow," she said. "But you must remember." Then the guardian spirit emerged. Taller than the tallest tree, cloaked in swirling vines and breathing the scent of thunder, it loomed over the crowd like the forest itself had taken shape. It spoke without lips, its voice a tremor in the soul. The land cannot survive without balance. A pact must be renewed. Zenzile raised both hands. From this day forward, a guardian must be chosen. One who walks between spirit and flesh. Not for power. Not for praise. But for peace. The villagers listened, hushed. This was no request. It was the price of survival. To forget again, Ayanda said, is to rot again. And the next time, we will not whisper. Then something miraculous happened. The tree of lament, once feared and hated, began to bloom. Not with leaves, but with glowing petals of gold and white. Each petal held a symbol, one for truth, one for memory, one for justice. As dawn finally broke, a single sunbeam pierced the mist and touched the tree. Its bark shimmered like molten sunlight. Birds sang for the first time in months. A soft breeze moved through the grass. The village of Ukanga stood in silence, reborn in the shadow of its reckoning. The trial was over. But the story was only beginning. As the golden light from the tree of lament bathed the village, a hush fell over Ukanga. The air, once thick with dread and sorrow, now shimmered with a sacred calm. At the heart of the tree, where Zenzile's lifeless body had hung mere hours before, something miraculous was unfolding. Slowly, her chest began to rise and fall, subtle yet unmistakable. The spirit's power coursed through her veins, weaving flesh and soul anew. Zenzile's eyes fluttered open, glowing softly with the ethereal light of the forest. She breathed deeply, as if tasting the very essence of life itself. Around her, the spirits, Ayanda and the ancient forest guardian, watched with pride and tenderness. The curse that once bound the village was breaking, reshaping into a blessing through her resurrection. No longer just a girl of flesh and bone, Zenzile was now a bridge between worlds, half spirit, half mortal, a living guardian with the strength of the forest flowing through her. Her hair seemed woven from the midnight sky and the green leaves, her skin radiant with an inner glow. The villagers watched in awe and reverence, some falling to their knees, others wiping tears from their faces. The girl they had condemned was now the symbol of hope and renewal. As she stood beneath the tree, the land around Ukanga began to transform. The oppressive drought that had haunted the village for years lifted like a shadow fleeing the dawn. Tiny shoots of green sprouted from cracked earth, and the air grew thick with the scent of blossoms. Within moments, crops that had long withered began to bloom, flowers unfolding in a riot of colors, and the rivers that once ran dry swelled gently with fresh water. The villagers could hardly believe their eyes. The tree of lament no longer stood as a symbol of fear, but as a pulsing heart of life, glowing with the vibrant energy of the forest itself. Its branches stretched toward the sky, as if embracing the sun, while roots sunk deeper into the earth, anchoring the renewed spirit of the land. Yet, not all changes were visible. Those elders who had betrayed Ayanda and Zenzile vanished in silence. One by one, their names were erased not only from the village records but from the memory of the land itself. The wind carried no whispers of their deeds or their existence. It was as if they had been swallowed by the very forest they once tried to conquer. No angry spirit cursed them, no retribution marked their path, only absence, a fading into the mist of forgotten mistakes. The children of Ukanga, once afraid to speak the names Ayanda and Zenzile, now gathered eagerly around the elders, listening to stories told under the great canopy of the forest. These stories no longer spoke of witchcraft or curses, but of truth, justice, and balance. The mothers told their daughters about Ayanda, the forest priestess who had protected the sacred harmony between humans and spirits, and about Zenzile, the brave girl who rose beyond betrayal to become their protector. A young girl, no older than Zenzile had been when her mother was taken, stood at the edge of the village one evening, eyes wide with wonder. As the wind whispered through the trees, she heard a gentle voice carried on the breeze. It was soft yet clear, filled with warmth and ancient wisdom. The voice told her stories, stories of courage, of standing for what is right, and of the delicate balance between the seen and unseen worlds. "You are never alone," the voice said. "From the roots of the hanged and the buried, truth will always rise." The girl smiled, feeling a strength bloom inside her chest, a connection to the past and a promise for the future. She knew, as did all who lived in Ukanga now, that the spirits of Ayanda and Zenzile walked among them, guardians watching over the village and the sacred forest beyond. Under the glow of the Tree of Lament, the village thrived, no longer haunted by curses but blessed by a living legacy. The earth and sky were in harmony once more, and the cycle of life continued, rooted in truth, nourished by justice, and protected by the spirits who had risen from the darkness. And so, the story of Ukanga, its cursed tree, and the two spirits who rose that night became a tale not of sorrow, but of hope, passed down through generations, reminding all who heard it that no matter how deep the roots of injustice, the light of truth will always find a way to rise.